The morning broke pale and thin, as if the sun itself had lost its strength after the long winter. Early spring carried the smell of thawing earth, damp wood, and the faint sweetness of grass pressing through frostbitten soil. A wind slid down the main street of Harrow's Crossing, tugging at the hats of men lingering by storefronts and stirring the dust that had lain quiet for months. Horses stamped their hooves impatiently, their breath fogging in the chill. And down that street, walking with a gait too slow for her years, came a woman holding the small, fragile hands of two children. Eleanor Hayes had once been known for her beauty, though now it clung to her like a memory blurred at the edges. Her face was gaunt, her cheeks hollowed, her lips pressed thin with the quiet defiance of one who refused to break. A strand of chestnut hair, dulled and unwashed, slipped from beneath her bonnet and curled against her temple in the wind. She held her shoulders back not out of strength but out of habit, the last fragile thread of dignity she owned. At her side little Laura, 7 years old, eyes too watchful for her age, clutched her mother's skirt in one hand and her brother's fingers in the other. Samuel, 5, stumbled as though each step weighed twice as much as his body. His boots were scuffed to bare leather, his lips dry, his gaze half lost in hunger. In Eleanor's palm, curled tightly, was the last piece of her past that glimmered, a gold wedding band, thin and worn, etched with the faint scratches of years. She had polished it against her skirt until it shone. Now it caught the light weakly, like a dying ember. The town saw them coming. Men in broad hats and dust-caked boots leaned against the hitching posts, their eyes sliding over the widow and her children before darting away, ashamed or simply unwilling to be caught in her gaze. Women carrying baskets shifted to the other side of the street. Some lowered their voices. Some did not bother to hide their whispers. The widow of Thomas Hayes, once a rancher with 40 head of cattle, reduced to begging. Eleanor felt the words sting like lashes, though no one had spoken them aloud. She stopped before the blacksmith's shop, where heat from the forge licked out into the morning chill. Inside, sparks leapt like fireflies as a hammer struck iron. She stepped forward, her children pressed against her skirts, and held out the ring. "Please," her voice came soft, nearly breaking, "buy this. My children haven't eaten in 3 days." The blacksmith, a heavy man with soot-streaked arms, looked at her with something like pity curdling into discomfort. He shook his head and went back to his work without a word. She turned to another man standing nearby, a merchant with a velvet vest that strained against his belly. "Sir, I'll sell it cheap, just enough for bread." The man raised his hand as though batting away an insect. "Best not shame yourself further, Mrs. Hayes." Eleanor's throat tightened, her fingers clutching the ring until it dug into her skin. She bent down to Samuel, brushing his hair back from his eyes. His belly groaned loud enough that the merchant grimaced and hurried off, muttering something about indecency. Laura pressed closer to her mother, whispering so faintly only Eleanor heard. "Don't cry, Mama." But Eleanor was not crying. Her eyes burned too dry for tears. She straightened, lifted her chin, and moved down the line of shops. Each step felt heavier. At the corner, beneath the shade of the sheriff's office porch, stood a man in a badge, Sheriff Roland Beckett. He had once dined at her table when Thomas was alive, had laughed with wine in hand, and called her sister in spirit. "Roland," she said, her voice reaching out like a thread, "please, you know me." He looked at her a moment too long, then tugged at his vest and spat into the dust. "Folks ought not to beg in front of children," he said, his words flat, his eyes flicking toward passers-by. "It gives a poor lesson." Her heart twisted at the cruelty disguised as righteousness. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Laura's small body trembled against her hip. Samuel whimpered. And then, from the far side of the street, a figure detached itself from shadow. He was taller than the rest, broad through the chest, his hat brim casting a line across a scar that curved faintly along his jaw. His stride was slow, unhurried, like a man carrying both patience and pain in equal measure. Jonathan McGraw had lived on the outskirts of Harrow's Crossing for years, a solitary rancher whose land stretched into pine-shadowed ridges no one else claimed. Few knew his words, fewer still his thoughts. But now he crossed the street, the ground seeming to bend beneath his weight. Eleanor stiffened as he stopped before her, silent, the air thick with the stares of every townsperson who had pretended not to see her moments earlier. Jonathan lowered his gaze to Samuel, who clung weakly to his mother's skirt, and then to Laura, whose eyes flared with a mixture of fear and defiance. Without a word, Jonathan reached into his coat and pulled free a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. He knelt, the scar on his jaw catching the sunlight, and broke the bread in half. He placed a piece in Samuel's hand, then one in Laura's. Their little fingers clutched it as if it were treasure, their eyes wide, disbelieving. Eleanor's breath caught. She wanted to protest, to insist she would pay him with a ring, but before she could speak, his voice came low and steady, rough with silence long kept. "Who kept you hungry?" The question struck her harder than Roland's cruelty, harder than the town's whispers. She blinked at him, the words lodging in her throat. Shame fought against relief, pride against desperation. Her lips parted, and the truth spilled out like something torn from her chest. "My husband's kin," she whispered. "They chained me in their house after he died. Said the land was theirs. Said if I wouldn't hand it over, they'd let us starve." Her fingers trembled around the ring. "I escaped in the night. This is all I had left." The loaf crumbled as Laura bit into it, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Samuel ate hungrily, too weak to speak. Jonathan rose, his shadow stretching long across the dirt. The townsfolk hushed, their eyes pinned to the scene, some in shame, some in curiosity, some in fear of what might come. Eleanor looked up at the rancher, her mouth forming words she could not bring herself to say. Jonathan did not ask for her ring. He did not offer comfort in the manner of softer men. Instead, he lifted his gaze toward the horizon, then back to her, his eyes narrowing with a weight she could not read. He reached for the ring in her hand, not to take it, but to curl her fingers back around it. His palm closed briefly over hers, rough skin against fragile bones, before he stepped back. "Keep it." His voice carried across the street like the growl of distant thunder. Eleanor's knees weakened. She nearly sank to the ground, but steadied herself, her children pressed close. Jonathan tipped his hat, turned, and walked toward the edge of town where his wagon waited. He did not glance back, but after a few paces he stopped. He turned his head slightly, his words drifting like smoke in the wind. "Come along." The town erupted in whispers. Eleanor stared after him, the ring burning in her palm, her children looking up at her with crumbs clinging to their lips. For a moment she felt caught between shame and salvation, between fear and something that might one day resemble hope. Her heart thundered in her chest, her breath shallow. Laura tugged her sleeve. "Mama, can we?" Eleanor looked down the street where Jonathan's broad figure moved toward the waiting wagon, where the horses stamped as though sensing the shift of fate. Her lungs filled with air that tasted sharper, freer, though laced with fear of what followed. And as she took that first step after him, the eyes of the town burning on her back, she felt the old world fall away like dead leaves. She did not know where his path would lead, only that in the silence of his question, "Who kept you hungry?" something had begun that could not be turned aside. The wagon loomed ahead, the man standing beside it, silent, waiting. The wind rattled loose boards along the street, the sheriff's gaze heavy from the porch, and Eleanor's pulse beat against her throat. She gathered Laura's hand, Samuel's fragile fingers, and walked toward him, her ring still clutched tight, as if the last fragment of her life had just been bound to the next. The wagon wheels creaked as they left the edge of town, the sound hollow and tired as if the wood itself carried the weight of all unspoken things. The road wound northward through fields where frost still clung to the shaded grass, though here and there shoots of green pressed upward in quiet defiance. The air smelled of pine and thawed soil. The faint promise of springs returned brushing against Eleanor's senses like a mercy she did not yet believe in. She sat at the back of the wagon, her children huddled against her sides, while Jonathan McGraw drove in silence, his hands steady on the reins. Laura leaned into her mother's arm, chewing what was left of the bread he had given, crumbs caught at the corners of her mouth. Samuel had fallen asleep almost at once, his head heavy in Eleanor's lap, his lips parted in the shallow breath of a child who had known too much hunger. She brushed his hair gently, her thumb smoothing the curve of his brow. Every few moments she looked up, her eyes catching the broad shoulders of the man before her. He did not turn, did not speak, but the straightness of his back carried a kind of watchfulness, as though he could sense each question she could not bring herself to ask. The land began to change as they rode on. The prairie opened into rolling hills and then gave way to pine forest, the trees tall and dark, their needles whispering in the wind. Patches of snow lingered in their shadows, but the sun broke through in shafts that caught the dust rising from the horses' hooves. Birds darted from branch to branch, their songs hesitant, like the first notes of a tune unsure if winter had truly passed. Eleanor felt her chest ache with the beauty of it, a beauty she had almost forgotten existed. When the cabin came into view, nestled among the trees at the curve of a small stream, her breath stilled. It was not grand, not new, but it was whole. The roof sloped heavy with cedar shingles, the smoke from the chimney curled in a thin white thread, and a corral stretched beside it with horses shifting in the mud. A barn stood further back, its boards scarred with weather, but the whole place bore the marks of care. Mended fences, cut wood stacked neat by the wall, a porch swept clear of snow. Jonathan halted the wagon and climbed down without a word. He tied the horses, then turned, his gaze meeting Eleanor's. He extended a hand, not as a gentleman might in courtship, but as a man who offered steadiness to another who had walked too long alone. She hesitated, the ring still pressed into her palm, then placed her fingers in his. His hand was warm, rough, and he guided her down as if she were carrying something fragile, though the only weight she bore was weariness itself. Laura climbed down after, clutching the hem of her mother's dress, her eyes wide as they swept over the homestead. Samuel stirred and whimpered, and Jonathan lifted him easily, the boy's head falling against the rancher's shoulder as if he belonged there. Eleanor wanted to protest, to reclaim her son, but the sight of Samuel's small body safe in those steady arms silenced her. Inside the cabin, warmth pressed against them like a blanket. The hearth glowed with coals, and the air smelled faintly of pine resin and bread long cooled. A table stood in the center, worn but sturdy, with 2 chairs on one side and another set apart, as if waiting for someone who never came. Jonathan laid Samuel down on a pallet by the fire, then straightened. "You'll rest here," he said, his voice low, certain. Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came. She looked around, her eyes catching on the neatness of the room, the shelves lined with jars of dried beans, the rifle hanging above the hearth, the boots by the door. It was a man's life, solitary, ordered, and now, for reasons she could not fathom, it had opened to her. "I'll work," she managed at last, her voice trembling but firm. "I won't take charity." Jonathan regarded her for a long moment, then gave a single nod. He did not argue, did not soften, only turned and set about placing kindling on the fire. The conversation ended there, yet something in that silence felt like respect. The days that followed unfolded with a rhythm both fragile and healing. Eleanor rose before dawn, her body stiff from years of hardship, and set to work as if proving her worth might keep the roof over her children's heads. She swept the cabin, scrubbed the pans, patched clothes with trembling hands. She learned where he kept the flour, how he stacked his wood, which horses favored oats and which preferred corn. At first Jonathan said nothing, merely watched with a gaze that revealed little. But slowly, his silences shifted. One morning she found a quilt folded neatly at the foot of her bed, stitched not with care but with necessity, patched from old shirts and coats. He never mentioned it, and she never asked, but that night she slept warmer. Another evening, after she had baked biscuits with the last of the flour, she found him lingering at the table, his eyes softening at the sight of her children eating with their mouths full for once. He did not smile, but the tension in his shoulders eased, and that was more than enough. Laura began to laugh again, the sound like bells in the pine air. Jonathan carved her a doll from a scrap of cedar, the shape rough but cradled in her hands as if it were ivory. Samuel grew stronger, chasing chickens across the yard until his cheeks flushed red. Eleanor watched, her heart a fragile vessel filling again drop by drop, though she dared not name the feeling. But the town was not far, and its whispers carried even into the pines. Mrs. Hensley, the widowed neighbor whose farm sat 2 miles east, came one afternoon with a basket of eggs. Her eyes flicked over Eleanor's thin frame, the children playing in the yard, and lingered on Jonathan where he chopped wood. "You ought to be careful," she said, her voice sharp though her mouth smiled. "Folks will talk, a widow living in a bachelor's house. They'll say you shame your husband's memory." Eleanor bit back her reply, her hands tightening on the basket. Shame had already carved itself into her bones. She would not let another woman's tongue deepen the wound. Jonathan's axe struck the log with a crack, his gaze flicking toward them, but he said nothing. It was not until dusk that Eleanor's past returned in flesh. A rider approached as the sky bled pink over the hills. Jonathan stepped onto the porch, rifle leaning against the wall, and watched as the man dismounted. Eleanor froze when she saw his face. Matthew Cole, her brother-in-law, her tormentor, the man who had starved her children in the name of greed. His boots crunched over the dirt, his eyes narrow and sharp as a hawk's. "Well, well," he drawled, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Didn't take long to find where the stray dog ran." Eleanor pulled Laura and Samuel close, her breath hitching. Jonathan did not move, though his jaw clenched like iron. "You belong with family, Ellie," Matthew went on, his smile thin as a knife. "Thomas's land ain't yours to keep. You come back quiet, and maybe we'll forget your little stunt." Jonathan's voice cut across the air, low and unshaken. "She ain't yours." Matthew's gaze flicked to him, sizing him up. "This ain't your matter, McGraw. She's Hayes' blood by marriage, and what belongs to Hayes stays with Hayes." Jonathan stepped down from the porch, the last of the sun catching the scar on his jaw. His eyes were steady, but the fire beneath them was plain. "You left her children hungry. That makes it mine." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Eleanor's heart thudded, her hands trembling on her children's shoulders. Matthew spat into the dirt, eyes narrowing. "You'll regret crossing me," he said, mounting his horse again. "This ain't finished." The hooves thundered off into the dusk, leaving the air colder than before. Jonathan turned back, his gaze catching Eleanor's. For a heartbeat, his expression softened. Not pity, not desire, but something heavier, as if he carried her burden on his own shoulders. He looked toward the line of pines where the rider vanished, then back at her. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but each word settled like stone. "This ain't finished." The nights in the pines carried their own kind of silence, heavy yet alive, as though the trees themselves held their breath to listen. Eleanor often sat near the fire after her children had gone to sleep, her body folded in exhaustion but her mind restless. The crackle of the flames played against the quiet tick of Jonathan's boots as he moved about the cabin. Sometimes he sharpened tools, sometimes he sat with a book open though he read little, and sometimes he simply stared into the hearth as if its light reminded him of something long gone. On such a night, with Samuel curled beneath a quilt and Laura dreaming soft against her pillow, Eleanor found herself speaking words she had carried like stones for months. She kept her eyes on the fire, afraid of his gaze, and let the confessions slip in pieces. "They locked me inside," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hiss of the logs. "After Thomas died, his kin claimed the land, said it was theirs by blood. When I refused to sign it over, they barred the doors, shuttered the windows. Said hunger would teach me obedience." Her fingers gripped her skirt, knuckles white. "I begged them, Matthew most of all. I begged him to let the children eat. He'd leave scraps at first, just enough to keep us alive, then less, until the little ones cried through the night. When Samuel stopped crying, when only silence came from him, I knew we would not last." She swallowed hard, her throat thick with the taste of those nights. "I climbed through the smoke vent, carried them in my arms into the dark. That ring was all I took. I thought I would sell it and feed them. That was the plan. That was all I had." Her voice fell away. The fire popped. She dared not look at him, but she felt his stillness, the way the air shifted. When he spoke, it was quiet, but something beneath it trembled like steel pulled too tight. "My mother," Jonathan said, eyes fixed on the flames, "was kept the same. Not with chains, but with words and fists. My father's kin said she was weak, unfit, nothing but a burden. She bore it until one winter, when her ribs showed clear as a ladder. My father found her near death. After that, he took us away. He never spoke of it again. But I saw what it did to him, and to her." The room filled with the ache of memories neither wished to carry, yet in sharing them something shifted, fragile as thawing ice. Eleanor glanced at him, just briefly, and in his scarred face she saw not judgment but recognition. Pain mirrored, grief understood. The days that followed carried a different weight. Eleanor's work about the cabin no longer felt like mere labor but like rebuilding her life from ash. She mended Jonathan's shirts with steadier hands, swept the porch so her children might sit there in sunlight, and planted seeds in a small plot near the stream. Jonathan taught Samuel how to saddle a pony, his large hands guiding the boy's tiny fingers. He showed Laura how to set traps for rabbits, patient even when her small hands fumbled. Slowly, laughter returned to the clearing, tentative but real, and each sound carved away a piece of the darkness lodged in Eleanor's chest. Yet outside the pines, tongues wagged. Mrs. Hensley arrived again, her face pinched with concern she wore like a badge. She carried word of whispers, that Eleanor dishonored her husband, that she lived as a kept woman in Jonathan McGraw's cabin. The sheriff's name slipped in too, a reminder that law and gossip often shared the same table. Eleanor received the words in silence, her jaw tight. After the woman left, she stepped onto the porch, breathing hard, and found Jonathan splitting wood. She wanted to ask him if it mattered, if he would send her away to keep peace. But before she could form the question, Samuel darted across the yard clutching a stick like a sword, laughter ringing behind him, and Jonathan's lips lifted, just faintly but enough. Eleanor swallowed her fear and let the question die. Still, unease lingered. At church, where she once found solace, heads turned coldly. Women pulled their daughters close, men whispered behind hands. Laura squeezed her mother's hand until her knuckles ached. Jonathan stood beside them, silent, his broad form a shield, yet even his presence could not quiet the sting of judgment. It was not gossip that truly tested them, though, it was Matthew's return. He came with 2 men at his side, rough riders with eyes sharp as blades, arriving at the ranch as evening laid gold across the trees. Eleanor froze at the sight, fear locking her breath, while Jonathan stepped from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Time to come home, Ellie," Matthew called, his grin sour with triumph. "We've been patient, but the land won't wait. You and the young ones belong with kin." "You starved them," Jonathan said, his voice calm, though the cloth in his hands twisted tight. Matthew shrugged. "A lesson poorly learned, perhaps. This man shelters you, feeds you. What happens when he grows tired? Better to come home now." Eleanor felt her children clutching at her skirts, their small bodies trembling. Her throat burned with words she could not force past her lips. Jonathan dropped the cloth, straightened, and his voice came out deep, steady as stone. "She ain't leaving here. Not with you." The hired men shifted in their saddles, hands brushing the butts of their pistols. Eleanor's heart hammered. The yard seemed to shrink, the pines crowding in. For a moment she thought blood would be spilled then and there. But Matthew's eyes narrowed, calculating, and he pulled on his reins. "This ain't finished," he spat, echoing the words he had left behind before. "We'll return with the law. And when we do, she'll regret crossing me." They rode off, hooves drumming the earth until only silence remained. Eleanor's knees threatened to give, but she forced herself upright, her children pressed close. Jonathan bent to pick up the cloth, his face unreadable. Then he looked at her, and for the first time his words held not only resolve but promise. "You ain't going back there," he said. "Not while I draw breath." The quiet that followed was thick with meaning. Eleanor felt something inside her break, but it was not despair, it was the fragile shell of isolation she had worn for too long. Her lips trembled, and she turned away before tears betrayed her. That night, she sat by the fire again, the children asleep, Jonathan sharpening a blade. She watched him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The air between them was heavy, yet not unbearable. She thought of his words, of his vow, and though fear still shadowed her heart, a flicker of safety began to glow there too. But the town's whispers grew louder. Sheriff Beckett arrived days later, his voice hard as he claimed Matthew had filed grievance, accusing Eleanor of theft, of abandoning rightful family. The law's weight tilted, as it often did, toward the wealthy and the cruel. Beckett warned Jonathan to keep clear of the matter, his eyes narrowing as if daring him to resist. Jonathan gave no answer, but the tension in his shoulders spoke enough. Eleanor watched all this unfold, torn between gratitude and dread. She had brought danger to this man's doorstep, Yet he had taken it upon himself willingly. She longed to ask why, to know what he saw in her that was worth defending. But words failed her, and she remained silent, tending to her children, patching clothes, planting seeds, as if by doing so she might prove her worth. One evening, as twilight pressed violet against the pines, Jonathan returned from town later than usual. His eyes were dark, his jaw set. Eleanor sensed something had shifted. He set his hat aside, stood by the window, and finally spoke. "Matthew won't stop. Sheriff's in his pocket. The town listens more to whispers than truth. He means to take you back, by law or by force." Eleanor's hands trembled on the hem of her dress. She thought of chains, of empty plates, of her children's hollow eyes. Her heart stuttered in terror. Jonathan turned to her then, his scar catching the lamplight. "But I won't let him. I've seen hunger break a soul. I've seen cruelty strip the life out of a woman. Never again, not while I stand." The fire snapped between them, the children stirred faintly in their sleep, and Eleanor felt the weight of his vow settle into her chest. She could not yet call it hope, but it was more than she had known in many seasons. And yet, beneath that promise lay the shadow of what was to come. For Matthew's words still lingered in the air, a warning coiled tight as a rattlesnake. The pine wind carried the echo, and as Eleanor looked at Jonathan's steady face, she knew the storm had only begun. The morning broke with a strange stillness, as though the pines themselves knew what was coming. Mist lay low across the pasture, and the air held the sharp bite of spring frost that had not yet surrendered to the sun. Eleanor rose before the children stirred, her hands trembling as she drew the shawl tighter around her shoulders. She moved to the door, listening. No sound yet, only the soft groan of the timbers as the cabin breathed against the cold. But she felt it, deep in her bones, the gathering weight of trouble that had been promised. Jonathan was already outside. She could see him through the doorway, his broad form cutting against the pale dawn. He was stacking wood near the porch, movement steady, deliberate, as though preparing the place for siege. She watched him without speaking, her heart tightening. There was no fear in his posture, only resolve, but that was its own kind of terror, for she knew what it meant. He expected them. She stepped onto the porch. Her feet were bare, the boards cold beneath them. He turned slightly, his eyes catching hers. For a moment neither spoke. The mist clung to his hat brim, to the scar at his jaw, making him seem carved from the same stone that anchored the mountains beyond. "They'll come," he said at last. His voice was low, certain. Eleanor's throat closed. She thought of her children still warm in their quilts, of the lives she had fought to keep breathing through nights of hunger. She thought of the ring still clutched tight in her palm, her one remnant of the past. "And when they do," she whispered. His gaze did not waver. "We'll meet them standing." The words settled in her chest like a vow, and for the first time she did not feel alone in her fear. By mid-morning, the sound arrived, hoofbeats. Faint at first, then growing, a drumbeat rolling through the earth. Eleanor gathered Laura and Samuel inside, drawing the curtains with shaking hands. The children pressed to her sides, their eyes wide, but she hushed them with a trembling finger. From the doorway she glimpsed Jonathan standing tall in the yard, rifle in hand, his stance unshaken. Matthew Cole rode at the front, his coat dark against the pale sky. Behind him, for men followed, pistols gleaming at their hips. They spread wide as they approached, like wolves circling. Matthew dismounted slowly, the sneer on his face sharp as broken glass. "You've made this harder than it needed to be," he called, his voice carrying across the yard. "She's coming home, McGraw. You can step aside, or you can get buried with her pride." Jonathan did not move. His voice, when it came, was steady, each word struck like a nail. "You starved them. You don't speak of pride." Matthew's grin faltered, just slightly, but he masked it with a laugh. He turned his head to the men behind him. "Take her." The riders spurred forward. Eleanor's breath caught as she pulled her children closer, but before panic could choke her, the sound of a gunshot split the air. One of the men's hats flew from his head as Jonathan fired, the bullet grazing past. The horses reared, chaos breaking in the yard. Jonathan's voice thundered through the smoke. "The next one won't miss." The riders hesitated, eyes darting. They had not expected this man, silent and solitary, to meet them like a wall of iron. Matthew snarled, drawing his pistol, but before he could raise it, Eleanor burst from the cabin. She had seized a wooden beam from the hearth, and with the strength of every hungry night, every desperate prayer, she swung it. It cracked against Matthew's arm, sending his pistol clattering to the dirt. For an instant the world froze. The mist swirled, the horses stamped, and Eleanor stood trembling, the beam clutched in her hands. Matthew staggered, rage twisting his features. He lunged at her, but Jonathan was there, faster than she could believe, grappling him back, the two men crashing into the mud. The struggle was brutal, silent save for the grunts of effort. Jonathan's fists struck like hammers, Matthew clawing back with desperation. Eleanor watched, breath locked in her chest, until at last Jonathan pinned him, his hand clamped at his throat. The hired men shifted, uncertain, their courage faltering. "You'll not touch them again," Jonathan growled, his voice dark as thunder. He released Matthew, shoving him into the mud. The man gasped, coughing, his eyes burning with fury. But when he looked around and found no ally stepping forward, something in him broke. He staggered to his feet, mud streaking his face, and spat toward the ground. "This ain't finished," he hissed. Yet his voice held less power now, the edge dulled by defeat. He stumbled to his horse, clutching his bruised throat, and the others followed, muttering curses as they mounted. Within moments they were gone, hooves fading into the distance, leaving the yard quiet but for the ragged breath of those who remained. Eleanor dropped the beam, her knees nearly giving. Jonathan straightened, his chest heaving, mud streaking his shirt. He turned to her, and for the first time his eyes softened. Not the steady calm of before, but something deeper, something raw. "You stood," he said quietly. Eleanor's lips trembled, her hands shaking as she reached for Laura and Samuel, who ran to her side. She held them close, their faces pressed to her dress, their small bodies trembling with aftershocks of fear. She looked back at Jonathan, her voice breaking. "I couldn't let him take them. Not again." He stepped closer, the distance between them closing until his presence wrapped around her like warmth. "And you won't. Not while I'm here." The words rang like an oath, stronger than any paper law. The sheriff arrived late, as if summoned by rumor more than duty. Roland Beckett dismounted, his eyes scanning the yard. Mud, blood, fear still hanging in the air. His jaw tightened when he saw Matthew's pistol lying in the dirt, when he saw Eleanor clutching her children beneath Jonathan's shadow. He understood without words what had happened, and though his mouth pressed into a hard line, he said nothing to condemn them. Perhaps even he saw that justice, rough as it had been, was truer than his badge. By afternoon, the mist had lifted. Sunlight spilled golden over the pasture, the pines whispering in softer tones. Laura played near the porch with her wooden doll, Samuel chasing chickens until his laughter rang clear. Eleanor sat on the steps, her hands still trembling but her eyes brighter than they had been in months. Jonathan joined her, lowering himself beside her without a word. For a long while they sat in silence, watching the children. Then he reached into his pocket and drew out her wedding ring. She startled. She had not even realized she had dropped it during the chaos. He placed it in her palm, closing her fingers around it with gentle insistence. "Don't sell it," he said softly. "It ain't a weight. It's a vow. Let it be what it was meant to be." Her breath caught, tears stinging her eyes. She looked at him, really looked, at the scar on his jaw, the steady strength in his gaze, and the quiet tenderness he tried so hard to hide. She whispered, her voice breaking, "My children called you Pa while we hid. I didn't stop them." The silence that followed was thick, charged with something that felt both terrifying and holy. Jonathan's lips pressed together, but he did not look away. He placed his hand gently atop hers, the ring caught between their palms. The pines rustled, the children laughed, and the world seemed to breathe again. Evening fell, painting the sky in streaks of rose and violet. The cabin glowed with lamplight, the hearth warm, the air alive with scents of stew Eleanor had made with what little they had left. They ate together at the table, the children nodding off mid-bite, their bellies finally full. When Eleanor looked across the table at Jonathan, she felt something unfamiliar but undeniable: safety. Yet as the night deepened and the fire burned low, the memory of Matthew's words lingered. This ain't finished. She knew it. Jonathan knew it. The law might bend again toward cruelty, whispers might sharpen into knives, and storms might yet rise. But she also knew, as she watched Jonathan lay a quilt over her sleeping children, that they would not face it alone. She closed her hand around the ring, its weight different now, no longer a token of what she had lost but a symbol of what might still be made. Her gaze drifted to Jonathan, who sat by the fire with his head bowed, and she whispered into the silence, though perhaps only the flames heard it. "We'll finish it together." The words floated in the stillness, and in them lived both promise and warning, love and defiance. Outside, the pines swayed in the wind, carrying the echo into the night as though all the land bore witness. The storm had broken, but another brewed on the horizon. And in that waiting hush, Eleanor felt her heart shift, not with fear, but with the certainty that the life she once begged to preserve was now bound to something greater, something worth every fight still to come.